Good evening and welcome to this special edition of the Journey Home program. We are taping here in Quebec, Canada. As a part of our trip to Canada, we've had a great privilege of filming a variety of shrines and churches and had tours of the historic sites of Canada. And it's wonderful to be here in Quebec, but one of the greatest privileges that we have is to have this interview with His Eminence Marc Cardinal Ouellet.
Yes.
Okay, I'm working hard at that. My French is not, it's un peu, but it's a great privilege to be with you, Cardinal.
Nice to meet you.
And thank you very much for taking this time to be with us. And we've had a variety of interviews with a tour guide and visited the seminary and wonderful sites like Notre Dame de Victoire. But I have a variety of questions to ask you to kind of fill us in on some of the great history, missionary spirit. But if I would love to begin with your own spiritual journey, if you could talk to the audience about how God has led you in your life here in Catholic Canada.
Oh, thank you. First for inviting me to address this program. I was born in northern Quebec at about 10 hours drive from here in a small village in a family of 8 children, Catholic family, and I grew up within this family, going to church every Sunday and going to school, and so learning my faith as any other Quebecer. But when I was a teen, I started to think about the future, and I had a deep desire to dedicate myself to something important in life. And the reflection on the meaning of life and on God as the creator and as the mystery of sciences, cosmos. And so I was fascinated by sciences and also the relation to God. So that was part of my intellectual research. But I believed since my youth it was an heritage. And so I had the help of a spiritual director, a priest, who helped me very much to journey and to be faithful to my commitment as a Christian. And so it brought me to the seminary at 19 years old. I was very young to enter the seminary. And at the seminary, I remember discovering Christ. Christ was a part of my sacramental life, but as Jesus, a close friend, so who would give a meaning, full meaning to my life. It was the discovery of the seminary, during my theological studies. So, and during these studies, I was thinking of the future. I had a desire to do some missionary work. So my mind was oriented towards Asia. But after I entered the Sulpicians, after my ordination, I went to South America. And I spent some years in Colombia as a professor in seminaries. So I worked in priestly formation. After a couple of years of parish work in my diocese in northern Quebec. So that was part of my journey, and it brought me to other studies, to a doctorate in theology, and in order to teach theology in seminaries. And then I became afterwards a professor of theology, of sacramental theology in Rome. After being called by the Holy See to teach at the Pontifical Lateran University at the Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family. It was founded by Pope John Paul II in 1981. So that was part of my journey, to deepen the theology of marriage and the family, and to share in the pastoral ministry of the Holy Father on this aspect, which is a priority of his pontificate. And when I was there, so I was called to become a bishop and to work at the Pontifical Council for promoting Christian unity. I spent almost 2 years at the Vatican working at this Pontifical Council before being appointed Archbishop of Quebec in 2002, November 2002, and I started my ministry here in Quebec City at the end of January 2003.
So you had a great number of experiences which have fed your call to be the leader of, and the audience may not realize that you're not only the Archbishop here of Quebec, but you're the primate of all of Canada.
Yes.
That's right. And in fact, the chair that you sit in here at one time was the Bishop of all of North America, right?
Exactly. Bishop François de Laval, the first bishop who arrived here in 1659, he spent 50 years of his life in Quebec City, and more than 25 as bishop. And then he retired, but he remained helping, and he's been beatified by Pope John Paul in 1980. So, and he is the first bishop of North America. His diocese covered the whole continent north of Mexico.
Yeah, his story is an amazing story.
Yes.
It really is, and I'm glad that in these programs that we're able to let more know about this wonderful man of God, because when you think about him coming here for 50 years, it wasn't with trains and shops, and it was a very primitive, right?
Exactly.
Very primitive time. Let me go back, if I could, to your own story, because it's not always the case that young men and women brought up in the church end up with a continuous commitment to the faith and the growth in it. Some grow up in the faith just like any others and then lose the faith, or at least drift away for a while before they come back. I'm wondering, as you look back to your own upbringing, the own traditions of your... Now you said 10 hours north. When I look at the map of Quebec, that's quite a ways north.
Yeah, it's halfway to James Bay.
I mean, that's way off the beaten path up there. But there was the uniqueness of your family and your local parish. As you look back, again, thinking about how we can encourage parents who are listening, what were some of the unique things of your own childhood that you think strengthened your faith, that helped plant the seed for your lifelong commitment to serve Christ in His church?
I think I had some very good examples of my grandfather. When I remember seeing him praying his rosary, you know, and he was an old man in his 60s, 70s, early 70s. He died at 72, and also a grandmother who was a saint, you know, mother of many children, very dedicated and joyful, and so maybe the influence of the grandfathers and mothers have been important to me. Also, the freedom that was left to me by my parents when I chose my vocation. And my father had a different idea. He would have expected me to help the others. You know, starting to work, I was a teacher. So I could have started to teach and help my brothers. So he just raised the question when he left me free to choose. And I chose to enter the seminary thinking that if God called me to the priesthood, He would provide for my brothers and sisters, and in fact they could study even to go to university and do their own studies without my help. So, but it was part of I mean, my education, certainly, the context of the family at that time, and there was a certain encouragement in the family to read good literature. So it did help me, you know, to grow. We had no television at the time. So, but we were interested and encouraged to read. It was part of my culture, and so afterwards I was always interested in deepening my faith and doing further theological studies, and it was key really to keep me at the heart of the church thinking.
It's beautiful to think that your grandfather is now smiling realizing that the praying of the beads was such a great influence on your life, but now opening the door for you to have such a great opportunity for leadership of the church, renewal, and encouragement of other young people to hear the same call that you heard. We're in this wonderful Quebec region of missionary spirit. I mean, when you look back on the founding of Quebec and Champlain and our ancestors that came, they came partially as an outpost of France, for economic reasons, but every ship that came brought with it the faith. And if you would, talk a bit about that missionary heritage of Quebec.
I think that few countries have a so extraordinary testimony of saints at the beginning of their story. I mean, the first bishop, as we said earlier, François de Laval, he was a great man, a simple man, and very dedicated to his people. He had to travel in very difficult conditions, and he was very ascetic, and at the same time, very encouraging for the people. He was the spiritual director to some extent of some sisters who were saints. For example, Marie de l'Incarnation, the first Ursuline, the first convent here of sisters. She is one of the greatest mystic in history of the church. She was called the Teresa of the New World. Teresa of Avila is world renowned, but Marie de l'Incarnation is extraordinary figure. Her account of her life and her contemplation of the Trinity, for example, and many other aspects are extraordinary. So, and you had the Jesuit. The Jesuit, I would say, Jean de Brébeuf, Isaac Jogues, Jérôme Lallemand, and others, they came, with the spirit of martyrdom, and they were living in so extraordinary conditions, difficult conditions of weather, of food, and distances, and tensions, with the natives, and and also wars between French and others, and the natives in between. And they had to really convey the message of the gospel with extraordinary spirit of contemplation. They were contemplative in action as Jesuits, And I would say that martyrdom, concrete martyrdom, was a sort of extra grace. They were already, in the way they were given to their ministry, already martyrs. So I am impressed when I read the stories of the Jesuit martyrs. I'm really impressed. And others, when I think of the Sulpicians, that Montreal was founded by Jérôme Leroyer de la Dauversière, a layman, but associated with Monsieur Ouellet, a priest, and together they were part of an association of the Holy Family. So they created the association in order to sustain the foundation of Montreal. And they sent here Maisonneuve, that was his name, that soldier, to be in charge of the colony at the very beginning. So it was a real mystical experience, the foundation of Montreal. Those people, they came also for commercial reasons, but the main interest of the founders, those who were sending the people, it was evangelization. So that was the spirit of Father Ouellet and the spirit of La Dauversière. So when we read our history, we are very impressed by the religious quality of the beginnings.
We, in this days after Vatican II, we recognize in Vatican II documents and the teaching of Vatican II an emphasis when it comes to evangelization, that on the one hand, And John Paul has done this so creatively in his writings, Ut Unum Sint, when it comes to the call to unity, that yes, on the one hand, we recognize that the fullness of the faith is in the Catholic Church, and so the old idea of salvation outside the Church, yes, that's part. There is no salvation outside the Church, as Christ established the Church as the channel of salvation. But yet we also recognize the other pillar, that there are those who've never heard. If they're invincibly ignorant, then we have God's mercy. We recognize those too. And throughout history, we sometimes an imbalance of one over the other. And personally, sometimes I think in the last 50 years, we've kind of gone the other way and said, well, God will have mercy on those that don't know. I'll leave those up to God. But you know, we're inspired by these Jesuit missionaries, because there was no one more invincibly ignorant than the Hurons and the Iroquois. I mean, they, you know, why not leave them alone? Leave them to God. But they were so deeply committed to the Great Commission to go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations with charity and love and service. I mean, that to me, isn't that their mission? I mean, they're called to our young people today to discover their faith and to share their faith with one another.
Oh yes, certainly. And that was the spirit of the first missionaries, you know, to bear witness to Jesus Christ. And that's always what the Church is doing, to bear witness to Jesus Christ, to announce the Paschal mystery of Jesus Christ. I mean, His passion, death, and resurrection, which is bringing salvation to the whole world, even to those who do not know. And they do not realize, but they are included in what He did for the whole humanity. So that's important. But we are called to announce that and to communicate the good news. It is the good news, and people have the right to know, you know, and to rejoice about that, and to, I mean, embrace this mystery of faith and salvation. I think we cannot keep for us what is a good news for the whole world. And to the extent that we are aware of the gift, we are committed to give it to others. You know, that's exactly the experience and the mission of the Church, you know, to communicate what has been received. Otherwise, we lose, we really risk losing the gift if we do not share it.
John Henry Cardinal Newman talked about the absolute importance of knowing history to understand our faith truly. And if we fail to know our history, then our faith can also be lost. And if you talk a bit about why it is so important to, especially Quebec Catholics and our young people here, to rediscover their heritage.
Oh yeah, so that's a real, I mean, priority. I mean, for our people to retrieve their roots, because our roots are religious and Christian and Catholics, and so our actual crisis is also, I mean, dependent upon a sort of a loss of memory. We have lost history, and so we have lost religion to some extent. So the way to retrieve our values and roots is through learning history. And the history of our foundation. That's true, I mean, at our level of Quebec, and that's true at any level. And that's important. You quoted Newman. So Newman, he went back to the fathers of the Church. And that was the way, I mean, he deepened the spirit of the Catholic Church, and so he returned to the Catholic Church. So that was the contact with the fathers was key in his spiritual journey. Yeah, certainly.
And one other thing, the fact that we remember these wonderful men and women that so sacrificed their lives here. And you mentioned Marie Catherine d'Augustine with L'Hôtel Dieu, and the Ursulines.
Yes.
And part of it, again, maybe talk even more about that it isn't merely remembering them, but it's understanding the significance of their prayers for us in the communion of saints. Because an awful lot of our young people don't appreciate the meaning and the power of the communion of saints.
Yes, that's true. And you mentioned Marie-Catherine de Saint-Augustin. She was the first, not the first, but short after the first group of religious sisters who took care of the sick in the first hospital in Quebec. And she arrived at 16 years old. She was just, she had just pronounced her vows, and she came here with a great spirit of giving her life, for the new world. And she had a deep sense of the communion of the saints, of sacrificing her life, and also of bearing the burden of sins in order to help, the people to be converted to the gospel. So her spiritual journey was a journey of a battle, a deep spiritual battle. Externally, she was a very serving everybody. Nobody would notice what was going on inside. Just her spiritual director would know the combat, the fight, the interior against the devils, having to struggle for charity, for chastity, and being faithful all the time. And she died at 36. And she was beatified in 1993. I was in Rome. I was so happy to be there. And I gave her example to so many youth, because she was close to Bishop Laval. And he knew exactly what she was living. So this contact between the bishop and this really sister who had a soul, a marvelous soul, but it was hidden. That's like the life of the saints. Most of the time, it is hidden. We discovered the saints after their death. Sometimes, like Mother Teresa, we know during their life. But as you said, the young people need, to go back to learn their history, and so to discover ideals and models of saints who are inspiring today, really.
In fact, as we visit here in this wonderful province of Quebec, everywhere we go, Saint Anne, Saint Joseph, Bonne Saint Anne, right? Isn't that the phrase, Bonne Saint Anne? And what's pray for us in French? I'm sorry.
Priez pour nous.
Everywhere we go. And doesn't it also emphasize that the great devotion that the early pilgrims and pioneers had for the Holy Family?
Yes.
In fact, why Saint Anne?
Exactly. So that was part, of I would say, the general devotion in the 17th century in France. There was a great movement of devotion to the Holy Family. The child Jesus, and so Saint Joseph, Saint Mary, and also extending Saint Anne, Saint Joachim, and so they brought this devotion to the New World, and it's amazing how you find all along the river, parishes with the name of the Holy Family, or named after the different saints, but also the Holy Family as a whole. And in Quebec, so you have the Basilica of Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré, and you have the Oratory of Saint Joseph in Montreal, and in the middle you have the National Shrine of Mary. In Trois-Rivières. So, these are three basic points of devotion.
Where you turn, every little town is the same.
Exactly.
My the first three generations of my family were married and buried over in Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré.
Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré.
No, Beaucatière, over across the river, down the riverway, and River Ouellet.
Rivière-Ouellet, Kamouraska.
Yeah, that was my first third. But the point is, Saint Anne, Saint Joseph, the saints are such a deep part of their lives, And again, that's part of my hope for this program, is that we'll re-inspire all those watching to appreciate the heritage of where they walk, where they worship, where they work even. I mean, even every building here in Quebec is built on this wonderful heritage. And of course, you have on your shoulders the leadership of this great group of people here, and so you are in our prayers. We're going to take a break now, and we'll come back in a bit for continuing our conversation. So just in a moment, we'll come back with more discussion with His Eminence, Marc Cardinal Ouellet.
Yes.
Ouellet. And we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Our guest this evening is His Eminence Cardinal Ouellet. And thank you very much so far, Cardinal, for doing a fine job of condensing a life's journey into such a short time, and also encouraging us to capture that missionary spirit that was such an important part of the beginning of Quebec. And I suppose let's come up to today, because at one point it would be easy to say that Quebec was one of the strongest Catholic regions in the world. Mm-hmm. It would be easy to say that. Yes. It influenced so much of every aspect of what it meant to be a Quebecois. Is that the right term? Mm-hmm. But there's always the issue of renewal. And I wonder if you could talk about renewal, and particularly authentic renewal, how one brings about true renewal.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. So, yeah, as you said, our experience of the faith was very much rooted in our history, and with so many saints, and we have other saints also. After the one who founded, we had many others, the founders of communities. Pope John Paul II beatified or canonized 14 figures of saints over the last 25 years during his pontificate, just covering Quebec. So, but till nowadays. But we've gone through a terrible time. Now the last 30 years have been a real change in mentality, in the religious attendance of the church. There is a real trial, I would say. And so it's a difficult time for believers to be faithful to their commitments, and we've had many vocations in the past, but now we have few vocations because there was a great movement of secularization. That means many institutions like hospitals, schools, colleges, and many others were ruled by the church for decades and for centuries, and then during the 60s and 70s they were taken by the state, and so it changed completely the religious panorama. And we've had what we call our quiet revolution in the early 60s with transformation of the educational system, which brought some good points, for a broader participation of the youth in higher education, and that was a good point. But on the level of spiritual values, it was not a success. And also of historical transmission of our heritage, it was not a success. And together with this social transformation, you had the Second Vatican Council. which was also a great event in the church, and it was an event of the Holy Spirit, and I believe deeply in the renewal of the church through the Second Vatican Council. But sometimes, you know, the result were not what we expected. We had a liturgical reform that was not implemented in the best way. I would say we have abandoned too quickly many popular devotions. All of a sudden we had to, you know, to take distance from the devotion of the Blessed Virgin Mary or the saints and the contemplation of the Holy Eucharist, for example. And so it was, not everything was accurate. But there was an effort to recenter, you know, on the meaning of the celebration of the Holy Mass and make sure that the devotions would be centered on Christ. And as the Council, you know, is orienting the Church. So, but I think for an authentic renewal, we really need to focus on interior life and not just on external changes of liturgy, but to cultivate, you know, a new contemplation of the Word of God, to put the Word of God at the center of our lives. That's fundamental. And our brother Protestants, sometimes on that point, you know, they brought us the good news on the sacramental. So they have to learn from us, you know, very much from us on the Eucharistic sense of the life and the sacraments in general. But so the accent on interior life, prayer life, contemplation, listening the Word of God, and also, you know, to attend the Paschal Mystery of Christ, which is celebrated in the Holy Eucharist. That's the center, not only of the liturgy, but of human history. That's the heart of the world. You know, this mystery of Christ in history. So I think that we need to re-announce the gospel from the heart of the gospel, which is the mystery of Christ. And this has not been present enough in our, I would say, in our popular devotions before the Second Vatican Council. So that's an important point for authentic renewal, you know, to really recenter around Christ. And that's the message of the Holy Father in his apostolic exhortation, Novo Millennio Ineunte, at the beginning of the new millennium. That's exactly what he said. I can restart from Christ. That's the heart, that's the reason for the church to be. The mystery of Christ that has to be received and announced.
Would you agree with this analysis? Let me give you an idea of this. I was an outsider. I was not a Catholic for the first 40 years of my life, and then converted to the Church, and now greatly love being home to the Catholic Church. But I've tried to even understand myself as I look back what happened in the last 40, 50 years to the great heritage that was there in the faith. And I wonder, is this another way of saying what you've just said? Would you agree? Is that, of course, there's a both and. There's the externals of our faith, the piety, the practices, the wonderful devotions, and then there's the internal life. The meaning of what the externals are about is the internal. And that maybe there was a time when the externals were emphasized very strongly, but there wasn't the internal devotion, that commitment that maybe should have been there. And then, at a time when we have the renewal of Vatican II, trying to bring about this renewal, people who had not had a deep faith but had an externals rediscovered the internal, but blamed the externals as a distraction to the internal. So they throw off the externals. And so the balance goes the other way.
Yeah.
It becomes only the internal
Yeah.
without the external.
Yes.
But both are important.
Yes.
It's kind of like, would you say it's like Jesus talking about the new wine and the wineskins are both important?
Yeah, as you say, we have this temptation, to say that we want to purify our relationship to God, and so to cultivate the interior, and then say that's the interior that is important. That is true, but our religion is incarnate. I mean, because God spoke to us in the flesh of His Son that became incarnate. So our religion has to take the way of incarnation too. I mean, the interior has to be expressed externally. And that's the sense of the bearing witness to the Word of God to the point of sacramental life. Sacramental life is to bring the internal to the testimony of a faith in Christ that is concrete and that is socially, bearing a message, bringing to visibility which is hidden in our heart, but which is given in order to be also communicated to others. So that's an important logic, the logic of incarnation. That's fundamental.
We're not far from St. Anne de Beaupré, the wonderful basilica and the steps and all the beauty that's there and the devotions that are there, and all of that represents the love of the Catholics here for St. Anne. But all of that points to the interior of our conversion to Jesus Christ and that indwelling of the Spirit. I mean, all that connects. And it's, to me, I'm so grateful to be Catholic now to discover both and, in my commitment to Christ. When we talk about renewal, what do you see then yourself, Your Eminence, in terms of your goals and desires for your leadership here in Quebec?
Taking into account, this heritage, spiritual heritage, I think of the Holy Family, spirituality, which is part of ourselves. That's our identity. So I think our families, I focus on the family. Part of my efforts is to focus on the family and to help discover a spirituality of the family, which is grounded on the gift of Christ, the child of God, which is given to us to be the heart of our family. And the relationship between Mary, Joseph, and Jesus is an inspiration for all families. So that's part, I think, of a program that would develop and to help people to rediscover the sacrament of marriage, which is a great blessing. The gift of Christ to the love of a man and a woman, this gift, this blessing of His presence, not only a sort of external ritual, but it's a presence of Christ which is at the heart of the family. So that's part of what can help families to grow and to be faithful. So that's one of my main concerns, but we know everywhere how the situation of the family is. So the threat, of divorce, and so we face so many difficulties for family today to remain together, to be faithful, to have children, and to bear a testimony to the generosity of life. So, and the other concern is the youth. So, fortunately,
I'm just curious. Have you seen since John Paul's visit in Toronto?
Exactly. I was there. and this was a eye opener and a sort of moment of great hope and of a new beginning. Because it was difficult to prepare this World Youth Day. It was difficult to bring people together, but once they lived out, this event, they came back with enthusiasm and with many young people, and with the desire to continue. So I am building upon this recent heritage, which this grace given by John Paul II. And so we've had other meetings, you know, with several groups of the World Youth Day, and we've been growing and continuing. So my dream is to really network the youth. And using internet and using all new means for new evangelization, we need new means, new energies, new enthusiasm, as John Paul is saying. So I think something has to be done here for the youth, to give them the sense that the faith is really making a difference in the meaning of one's life. And the fraternity that is lived out with others, you know, around Jesus, it is incomparable. And we must be proud of that and humble, and also to be missionaries with other young people, because you know that we have many suicide among the youth in our country. So young people are kind of calling, you know, to help, and so the young Christians are called to help and to help build a culture of life, a culture of love, a culture of hope, you know, for the youth in this country.
It would seem that, what's the name of the youth martyr of the Jesuits, the young man that wasn't a priest, but he was with the Jesuit martyrs, but there was a young man, a layman, right, that worked with, I forget his name, was it Lalande, I think it was, Jean Lalande, I think it was, but it would seem to me that there's a model for our young people.
Yes.
You know, it's one thing, I mean, certainly the priests are a model for us. Yes. But here's a young man that had dedicated his life to serve the priests in whatever their needs were, and it cost him his life. And again, there's an inspiration for the young people here.
Oh yes, because the testimony of religious life, you know, is important. Because you have the priesthood. The priesthood is a gift, and you have to help people to offer, so they are called to God. So that's part of, I would say, a natural sense of life too, to have a place for God in your life. But when you choose to follow Jesus Christ in the evangelical counsels, poverty, obedience, and chastity, and you are not a priest, you are bearing witness really to who is Jesus Christ. He is the founder of this new way of life. And it is a call for a love that comes from Him, and that calls you to respond to Him with the same love and the same lifestyle. So that's a marvelous testimony, and we need that very much. We need priests, but we need religious men and women, you know, to bear witness to the greatness and the uniqueness of Jesus Christ.
And John Paul's encyclical, Christa Fidelis Laeti, reminds the laity that they are called to be the frontline men and women in the spread of the gospel.
Yeah, at this moment I was talking about religious, but the laity, maybe one of the most beautiful messages of the Second Vatican Council is the universal call to sanctity, to holiness. And what I have observed myself is that those who have taken more seriously this call are the lay people, men and women. It is my experience of the church at this moment. There are new ecclesial movements founded by lay people, and they are fostering really the sanctity of life. It's amazing, and it's a sign of hope. And for me, I find that very inspiring.
Well, and of course, John Paul, our wonderful Pope, inspires that in so many people. Well, here we are during this special time of the year, Christmas on one hand, New Year's on the other, Talk a bit, I'd love to invite you to think back to when you were a young Catholic. How did your family, did French Catholics celebrate this time of year? And was there unique devotions to Catholics in French Canada?
Yes, I remember especially the Christmas. We had maybe it's particular to our culture. We would go to Mass at midnight Mass, and then come back home and have a big banquet. So that's our way. That was the custom at the time. You know, after Christmas Mass, we had a banquet for, to celebrate, you know, the birth of the Messiah, and we would distribute also the gifts, you know. So the gift of the Son of God, so brings about the gifts that we do to one another. So it's a great memory of the day of Christmas to me.
And of course, sadly, we live in cultures where materialism has so won the day. And so when Christmas comes, so many people forget St. Nicholas. They only think of Santa Claus. They think of the gifts, the presents. Your Eminence, how about a word of encouragement to folk to recapture the spirit of what Christmas is all about?
Oh yes, so that's we come back to the authentic renewal, and the authentic renewal, that's really the mystery of God that loves us so tenderly, and that He is giving us His only begotten Son, and when we contemplate, you know, the child, we see God's tenderness through the eyes of Mary, you know, on bearing this child in her arms. So that's so inspiring. I think we need just to have a quiet look to the child in the hands of the mother. I think it says everything. It seems to me, and the rest, you know, the external. That's good. I mean, that we need to give gifts to one another, but it overflows, you know, from this gift of God that we receive, and then in order to manifest that, our joy, so we share with generosity and with peace. Peace is so important, you know. He is the gift of reconciliation, of peace. So we share peace, we reconcile with one another. That's very important.
I'm again reminded as I come here to Quebec and see St. Anne and St. Joachim emphasized everywhere. It reminds us of such an important part that grandparents play in the spiritual lives of families. You know, imagine that St. Anne and Joachim had, you know, wondered here that their daughter in her own sanctity, and then through her comes the Savior of the world, and their connection with that. Well, our grandparents are important, significant people, and maybe during this time we got to make sure that they aren't lonely and they understand how much we love them.
Yes, and exactly, and for us here, I think one of the ways to recover our spiritual heritage is to listen to the grandparents, because they have kept or they recovered at this time, you know, something of their heart, and they want to convey the same message to at least to their grandchildren. So we see that in their hearts, in their eyes, in their gifts. And I think it's a time to appreciate. That's the time for families to come together, you know, and around the mystery that brings us together, and so to really strengthen our family ties. And the grandparents, they have their place. That's yes.
We're also at a time when we're surrounded by people thinking about New Year's resolutions. I'm going to be thinner, or I'm going to run more, or read more books. How about a word of inspiration, what we ought to look forward to committing ourselves to?
I think that the Church has a very important message on the 1st of January. For many years now, it's been declared the Day of Peace. The first day of the year, That's Day of Peace. I think that this day is for reflection. The first day is, in a way, the symbol of the whole year. So if we start with a spirit of peace, of prayer for peace, not only at the world level, but at the local level, at the heart level, I think we start with the church. And if we learn to follow the church in this day, we may also learn to follow the church in the key moments of the liturgical year. And to listen, this invitation that Christ calls us every Sunday to go and meet Him, and receive His shalom, peace. Peace, that's the gift of every Sunday, of the risen Lord, through the Eucharist. So that's basic for our culture, to recover this regularity, of Sunday Mass. Sunday Mass is a great gift, to learn again, to be human, to give space for God, to really appreciate our heritage, to bear witness to Jesus Christ.
And for many to rediscover the great sacrament of confession.
Exactly, the same thing, yeah.
And maybe this will be the year for some that, okay, I'm going to make a commitment to restore and to get back in step with my faith.
Exactly. So we are in a great effort, at the moment to really retrieve also this gift of God, which is the sacrament of reconciliation and confession. We need that to experience deeply the peace, the real peace of the heart.
That's right. Your Eminence, could we have your blessing? And in French.
La bénédiction du Dieu Tout-Puissant, Père, Fils et Saint-Esprit descende sur vous et demeure toujours. Amen.
Thank you very much, Your Eminence. Maybe just one quick word. Let's say a young man was watching this program and is discerning the call to the vocation of the priesthood. Real quick, what would you encourage him to do at this time?
To pray and to talk to a priest.
That's right. And hear his counsel, as you did in your own life. All right. Thank you very much for joining us on the journey home. It is a great privilege to be with you. Thank you for your witness. And I'm going to encourage every viewer to hold you in prayer.
Thank
your
you.
Work here as you serve to represent Jesus for all these people. And as Bishop Laval did in your chair so many years ago, reaching out to help the poor and encourage the many here who were suffering to live in this great country. But thank you very much for joining us. It's a great pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the journey home. I hope you enjoyed this special program. As I told the Cardinal, we're going to encourage you to pray for Quebec, for the renewal here, that all the families, extended families, and the priests will completely rediscover and enjoy this wonderful faith that represents the great missionary spirit of this place in North America. Thank you for joining us. God bless you. I'll see you again soon.